Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Friday, October 31st, 2025. Happy Halloween. And on Fridays, we talk about human behavior, justifications. And so the question I'm dealing with today, and in the next, a series of vlogs, if you will, what makes you want to get up in the morning? What motivates you to do what you do? What do you feel driven to do? And perhaps most importantly or broadly, how do you justify your existence? Is that even a question that you'd consider, or have you thought about it at some point along the way? Remember, as we've discussed previously in the Dr. J Vlog series, we as human beings are the justifying animal. It's literally what sets us apart from all other species. We're the one species where it's part of our communication strategies, part of our language, where we have to explain ourselves to other people, the rationale behind our thinking. We're the one species who, as part of our communication systems, have to justify why we're doing or why we've chosen one course of action over another. Again, for example, the lion who hunts down the zebra doesn't then have to explain himself to the rest of the pride. And in fact, the rest of the pride will just happily join in.
I imagine you don't see this every day.
Yeah, so that's just one of many countless examples in nature, right? Different species prey upon and eat other species. Of course, we're at the top of the predatory food chain, as it were, but nonetheless, the point is that in this case, or in the example that I'm using here, there's no lion cub, back home that's protesting, "Hey, I don't eat meat. I'm a vegan." But of course, human beings have to justify their food practices, and we do. And we have all kinds of different food practices, from meat eaters, of course, which most people are, to the vegans of the world. You've got people who have certain restrictions, dietary, often religious-based restrictions on what one's able to consume, and so on. And again, when speaking of religion, this whole issue, there are concerns then that people have about beliefs about God, or there's people have different beliefs about God, different religious practices, and that can often be contentious and lead to some serious conflicts as well. Or even, say the conflict that I recently observed online when I saw a brief clip of the Vice President of the United States, President J.D. Vance, who's a conservative, Catholic, Christian, self-described nationalist for that matter. But the tensions between himself and his wife, Usha, whose parents immigrated from India and who was raised as a Hindu. And I mentioned the examples specifically because when I saw Vance speaking at a rally recently, he announced that they were raising, or explained to the crowd that he was asked about this, but he explained that they were raising their children in the Christian faith and in the Catholic faith more specifically, and that their son had just had his first communion the previous year. And at that announcement, the crowd cheered and applauded wildly, kind of a public affirmation, if you will. And, as I was watching that, I was thinking to myself, I wonder how his wife, Usha, might feel being a non-Catholic, right, or a non-Christian, not to mention as a non-white. And again, she was raised in a Hindu tradition. Not that she was particularly strongly committed to Hinduism, but nonetheless. And so, again, the point is that that's really only an issue amongst human beings, right? We're the species who has to justify our very existence to each other, our family names, our heritages, our religious beliefs, sometimes just what we look like. We have to explain ourselves to others. Again, why we eat meat or choose to be vegetarians or veganism, why we like capitalism or socialism, or why we like democracy, or we might be partial to some forms of fascism or authoritarianism, why we conform to our biological sexes, or why we are trans, or why we think Canada or the US is a better place to live, or somewhere else entirely for that matter, or why we might hope that the Blue Jays or the Dodgers end up winning the World Series in the next couple of days. Or like my wife, you might not You would have to, sometimes you have to even justify why you don't care who wins the World Series, right? Now, how do I know that she doesn't care? Well, she asked me the other night, I was watching the Jays game, and she asked me the other night who the Jays were playing, and I said the Dodgers. And she immediately said or asked, again, didn't they just play? So I had to explain how the World Series works and the whole concept that the champ has to win 4 out of 7 games in a best of 7 World Series, or any, most of the major sports, some of the major sports championship series, right? So in things like baseball and basketball at the very least. And so beyond these examples, then we have to justify 1,000 or 10,000 other things that we think and believe and do. And that's the burden that we carry as human beings. And now if we think long and hard enough, though, about our existence, we come to realize at some point that the whole of human society kind of operates on the kind of set of imaginary beliefs that are widely shared, if not universally shared. And that's what we do on a regular basis. We justify who we are and how we are and so forth based on these widely shared beliefs, and they compel within us, if you will, almost a certain urgency and value that we have to take care of, and perhaps almost immediately. Now, again, there are many different things that human beings have to look after, but in the very first sense, in quite a literal sense, of course, it's quite true that there are urgent matters that have to be attended to. So in other words, obviously we need to eat and drink to survive. There are certain physical demands that we absolutely have to meet, at least if we're going to sustain ourselves as living, breathing, sentient beings. But of course, we also recognize there's a great deal of flexibility in all of this, especially in terms of how we accomplish these different tasks. There are many pathways forward. There isn't just one universal set of genetically engineered, or for that matter, cultural rules that govern our different cuisines and human consumption everywhere across the planet. Instead, it's kind of all hardwired, if you will, into our particular cultures to do different things, to respond to different ecological niches or different environments, and where they have their own histories and traditions of what to eat, when to eat, how to eat, and so on, just like our languages and so much more. And then consider just the issue of money, right? We all have to cooperate and believe that money is real in order for our current systems to work. The money is, of course, symbolic of work and effort to a degree, a certain value that we confer upon the substance itself. It's, of course, really just a piece of paper with scribbling on it. But nonetheless, we confer a great deal of value in a variety of different senses to this thing that we call money. Or if it's Bitcoin, we have an even harder time kind of conceptualizing what it is exactly that must look like, since it appears more like a code with sequences of numbers and letters that represent wallet addresses, transaction IDs, and these different kinds of unique digital signatures. But we have to agree that all of these things are real in some senses in order to get people to engage in certain kinds of exchanges. And these exchanges then are absolutely necessary for us, most of us at least, to acquire the most of the goods and the services that we use in our everyday lives. I can't speak for everyone, obviously, but I produce very little of the stuff that I consume on a daily basis. Instead, I directly and then mostly indirectly have to rely upon countless other people to get what I want or even need to survive. And we all have to then agree and cooperate with each other to ensure that we have all of these dozens or even hundreds of little exchanges every day. I get in the car, I drive to work, for example, right? I mostly obey the rules of the road. I stop at the coffee shop. I pay for an ice cap, which I've probably had too many of this year. I make sure that I have my parking pass on full display in my rear view mirror so I can park right outside of my office at the university. And because I've been at the same university for almost a quarter of a century, I get to set up each day in a really nice little office, teach stuff that I love to teach, do research that I love to do, and earn a very good salary at the same time so I can live quite comfortably. And so to me, it just seems like the easiest job in the world. But I suspect that that would be the case for most people, right? If you've been doing the same thing as I have for the last most of the last 38 years. So all of that, of course, is quite obvious. What's less obvious is the fact that while all of what I've just described is quite real in terms of our everyday existence, our corporeal, physical existence, and even in terms of our kind of social and psychological well-being, at another level, it's all kind of a collective fiction, right? And if you become truly aware and awaken to that, then you can see beyond the facade, if you will. Not because you're superior or that nothing matters, but rather because it's about having a broader perspective and deeper understanding beyond the immediacy of our everyday lives. It's about looking at, expanding our thinking beyond the narrow ways of thinking that keep us sort of trapped in this kind of illusion. My concern is that it's the illusions that we believe in that can so often mislead us or lead us down pathways that really don't make a lot of sense cosmically or in terms of the broader human condition or, from a more general perspective. So, for example, one thing that we'll often do is look around and identify people who belong to certain groups of people, who hold certain beliefs. And then we'll conclude on the basis of whatever our reasoning and whatever the fictions that we create, that somehow they're the problem. We're fine, we're good, we're righteous, we're deserving, but there are other people out there in these other groups who are less so. And it's like the crowd that I mentioned in their response to the Vice President, J.D. Vance, when he was speaking. So they're cheering for his son's first communion, was also kind of a way of implying that, oh, thank goodness, at least his children were being raised in the proper tradition, okay? And if they were being raised as Hindus, right, the implication was then that would be a problem, at least for them and from their perspective. They'd probably not be familiar with or appreciate the similar rites of passage that one finds, for example, in Hinduism. After all, it's quite a radically different religious belief system in so many ways. So, but nonetheless, even within the Hindu tradition, the Atman, or a spiritual entity, is cultivated through the samskaras. The authoritative and ancient Hindu scriptures, the Shastras, verify this notion where it's written that, quote, at birth, the soul is at a primitive level of development. It is only through the sacraments, samskaras, that it becomes reborn and thereby elevated, end quote. And so again, to get there requires a rite of initiation known as upanayana. It's the Hindu ceremony that marks a boy's formal initiation into spiritual learning, sometimes called the sacred thread ceremony. It's a rite of passage that signifies a spiritual rebirth and the beginning of a disciplined life of study, often involving the bestowal of a sacred thread called a yajnopavita. Now, again, the very word upanayana alludes to a coming nearer or initiation and welcomes the young Hindu into a society that's not dissimilar to the Jewish bar mitzvah or the Christian children's celebrating their first Holy Communion. But my guess is, again, that the crowd maybe wouldn't be perhaps as boisterous if Vice President Vance had announced that his son's initiation into Hinduism rather than Catholicism or perhaps even in Judaism. In other words, these might be the wrong stories, the wrong fictions, if you will. And again, I don't mean that in a dismissive way, right, or a put-down kind of way, but rather as merely a reflection of a different set of cultural beliefs. So the real fiction stems then from the belief that there's only one group that has privileged access and knowledge of God. And that's what, again, a lot of people believe. And that therefore everyone else is wrong or even worse, blasphemous or evil. And such is the nature and the power of our religious, cultural, and broader justification systems. And so if we were to take these kinds of beliefs then to their logical extreme, then what would we have to conclude about everyone who doesn't share our particular faith system? Right? the more than these are estimates, right? But the more than 2.2 billion Christians worldwide would claim that they're right and that everyone else needs to be converted or at least applauded for choosing wisely, while the more than 2 billion Muslims, not quite as many as Christians, but a very comparable number, but these more than 2 billion Muslims would probably disagree with the Christian's perspective, at least on that specific issue. And then what about the Hindus that I just mentioned a few moments ago? Because they exceed 1 billion total adherents, or the estimated 500 million Buddhists for that matter. Or then let's not forget the fewer than 20 million Jews worldwide, who perhaps, and I guess numerically speaking, often feel like the outsiders are excluded based on the geopolitical system, but also based on their histories and their relatively small numbers of adherents. And so I'm going to argue then on Sunday that the truly awakened and enlightened person has to look beyond the conventional religious systems and justification systems to get at the meaning and purpose of life. And that may sound a bit controversial, especially amongst the true believers of different faith traditions. But I genuinely believe that there's a way to reconcile all of these competing ideas and the kinds of justifications that, if you will, keep us locked in rather narrow understandings or even misunderstandings of what it means to be profoundly awakened and enlightened. So until then, well, I hope to see you then. And until then, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. Peace.